On a dark Louisiana highway in the summer of 1967, the hum of tires whispered against the road, headlights carved thin lines through the night, and then in one blinding instant, the world folded into silence. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and time itself seemed to stop. Within that moment, the brief and luminous life of Jayne Mansfield came to its end, and a chapter in Hollywood's golden age closed with her. Greetings, gentle listener. You wander now through memory's corridors with me. Before we step deeper, I invite you to share, in the quiet of your own space, when and where you are listening. In this way, we become part of a global weave of remembrance, a gathering of souls keeping alive the echoes of those who came before. If you wish, you may also support this journey by pressing the subscribe button, ensuring these stories continue to flow like a river across time. The silence of that highway lingers as though it were still with us, a shadow cast backward through decades, and yet from silence we turn to another sound, the faint cry of a newborn, Vera Jane Palmer, born on April 19, 1933, in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. Her first breaths were drawn not into wealth or glamour, but into a modest household, her father a lawyer, her mother a teacher. Yet even in these simple beginnings, the winds of impermanence soon arrived, for her father, Herbert, would die when she was still only a child, leaving behind a sense of absence that would cling to her like a secret perfume. Many who lose their fathers so young live with a hunger that is not easily named, a search for protection, affection, or validation that no later triumph can entirely fill. Was it here, in this early loss, that the restless spark was kindled, which would one day drive her toward the blinding lights of Hollywood? Her mother, Vera, remarried, and soon the girl called Jayne was moved far from her Pennsylvania cradle to the hot stretches of Texas. In Dallas and later in Phillips, she grew among wide skies and fields where the air carried both dust and promise. She was a bright child, said to have excelled in her studies, particularly fond of the arts, the piano, and the theater. One may picture her sitting at the keys, small fingers pressing notes, dreaming of distant stages that seemed impossibly far from her small town. Childhood often weaves together both the ordinary and the extraordinary, and Jayne's youth was marked by the common struggles of any girl in mid-century America. Yet within her shimmered a hunger that could not be contained. She devoured stories of the silver screen, of Jean Harlow, Mae West, and later the reigning queen, Marilyn Monroe. To a young girl, these figures were not mere entertainers, but dazzling constellations, beckoning from beyond the dark ceiling of ordinary life. Some recalled her as imaginative, playful, and already experimenting with ways of drawing attention, whether through charm or humor. What is attention, after all, but a form of love translated through the eyes of others? To be seen, to be recognized, to be adored. These desires are stitched into the human fabric, yet for Jayne they seemed almost a destiny, as though her very being leaned towards spectacle. The absence of her father left her clinging closer to her mother, yet one senses in her early years the duality that would follow her all her life. The devoted daughter and later mother against the ambitious starlet, the innocent girl against the daring woman who shocked polite society. From these roots in Texas soil, watered with both love and longing, grew a flower destined to be plucked too early. We might imagine Jayne as a teenager, walking home beneath wide Texan skies, the horizon stretching endless and indifferent, while within her heart the dream of another horizon burned brighter. She practiced her smile, adjusted her posture, and looked into mirrors as though rehearsing for an audience not yet assembled. She was said to have been fascinated by Hollywood magazines, clipping photographs of actresses, pasting them on her walls, gazing until her own reflection seemed to merge with theirs. How many nights did she whisper to herself that she too would one day be known, that the world would not pass her by as it had passed so many before her? The years unfolded, and Jayne grew into a young woman of striking beauty, but beauty alone was never her sole possession. Beneath the golden hair and wide smile lay a quick wit and a gift for languages. She would later boast of knowing several, from Spanish to German. Yet intelligence was seldom the path that Hollywood laid out for women of her type. In the era of the 1950s, the screen demanded something different, an archetype, a figure both exaggerated and constrained, a blonde bombshell, playful yet submissive, daring yet carefully constructed. Jayne would eventually mold herself to this form, yet in these early years the girl still dreamed not of caricature, but of stardom in its fullest sense, of being a great actress, perhaps even one who could outshine her idols. But dreams often grow heavier when carried alone. At just 16, Jayne married Paul Mansfield, a man older and steadier, who perhaps seemed like a safe harbor for a young girl adrift after so much loss. They would soon have a daughter, Jayne Marie, and though motherhood filled her with devotion, it also tightened the knot of tension within her. How to be both a mother and a star, how to reconcile domestic quiet with the thunder of ambition. In her heart, the glitter of Hollywood had not dimmed. Instead, it seemed to burn brighter, even more unreachable, as though fate itself were testing her resolve. Somewhere in those years, one may picture her watching late-night films while rocking her child to sleep, the shadows of the screen flickering across her face, blurring with the shadows of her own longing. The contradiction of her life at that moment was clear. Love of family, yet yearning for more than family could give. Was this contradiction ever truly resolved? Or did it remain an open wound, bleeding softly beneath every triumph she would later win? Thus the first steps of Jayne Mansfield's journey were not gilded but marked with struggle, with loss, and with quiet determination. The echoes of her father's absence, the devotion of her mother, the wide horizons of Texas, the cry of her infant, all these were threads that would be woven into the tapestry of her future legend. And if the girl of 16 already felt the pull of destiny, perhaps it was because she knew, deep within her, that time would not grant her the luxury of a long and ordinary life. The image remains. A young girl gazing not at her reflection, but through it, beyond it, toward a silver screen where stars live forever, and where she, too, longed to dwell. The image of that reflection, a girl's face blurred against the silver screen, lingers as a threshold between innocence and ambition. From the mirror, she gazed not merely at herself, but at the woman she might one day become, and the silence of her room seemed filled with the applause of an imagined audience. This quiet rehearsal of identity, so tender and secret, is the seed from which her future spectacle would grow. Yet before the lights of Hollywood could claim her, Jayne Mansfield was still a girl in Texas, walking beneath the wide skies and dreaming of escape. Her teenage years unfolded in the long shadow of post-war America. The nation was shifting, restless, filled with both promise and repression, and in the heart of Jayne there stirred the same conflict. She attended Highland Park High School in Dallas, where she was remembered as bright, if a little unconventional. Teachers saw her gift for languages and music, and classmates saw her beauty blooming earlier than most. Beauty can be both a blessing and a burden. It draws eyes before one is ready to be seen. Was Jayne flattered by the attention, or was she already practicing the art of turning gaze into currency, long before she knew its true cost? She threw herself into activities that allowed her to perform. In plays, in recitals, in social events, she began to test the edges of her charm. Some recall her as shy, others as bold, but perhaps both were true, alternating like masks depending on her audience. The theater has always been a place where truth hides behind performance, and Jayne seemed to understand this instinctively. When she played a part on stage, she was not only performing for her classmates, but also rehearsing for a future she believed awaited her. A stage far larger, a stage of the world. Her fascination with glamour deepened. She studied the poses of actresses in magazines, practiced smiles in photographs, and began to carry herself with a poise that was less of Texas and more of Hollywood. Yet even in these adolescent attempts, there was something poignant. For what is more fragile than the hope of a teenager, convinced that destiny has reserved a place for her, though the world gives no promise it will honor such conviction? In these years, she also nourished her intellect. She was no fool, though later the world would brand her as one, reducing her to a caricature. She read deeply, studied piano with discipline, and showed interest in philosophy and classical music. Perhaps there is a quiet sorrow in remembering this, for it suggests a woman far more complex than the shallow image that history would later preserve. Did she already sense that her mind would be ignored, her intelligence overshadowed by the brightness of her beauty? The restlessness grew within her, and by the time she approached adulthood, she could not imagine remaining confined to the narrow world around her. Dallas was not small, but for a girl whose eyes were filled with Hollywood stars, it might as well have been a village. She longed for more life, more recognition, more of herself than her surroundings allowed. And so she sought escape in the oldest way, by tying herself to another. In 1950, at the age of just 16, she married Paul Mansfield. He was 5 years older, a man who seemed stable, solid, perhaps a counterweight to her swirling dreams. Some whispered that her marriage was an attempt to grasp at adulthood too soon, while others believed she was simply following the conventions of her time, when girls often wed young. Perhaps both are true. What we know is that Jayne, though now a wife, did not abandon her dreams. She spoke of becoming a movie star even then, as though the role of wife were but one part she played while waiting for the larger stage to arrive. Her daughter, Jayne Marie, was born in 1950, and motherhood brought with it a tender devotion that even the tabloids could never erase. She adored her child, doted on her, carried her into photo sessions, and later into the arms of her glittering but chaotic life. Yet in these first years, the tension between mother and dreamer sharpened. For while she rocked her infant to sleep, she also whispered her ambitions into the silence. One might picture her standing at the crib, the soft breath of her child in the dark, while she stared out a window at stars that seemed to whisper back, not yet, but soon. Her marriage, though offering a semblance of security, could not extinguish this fire. Paul, practical and grounded, may have wished for a simple life. Jayne, shimmering with restless hunger, was never made for simplicity. The contradiction widened with every passing year, and the young bride found herself drawn ever more insistently toward the city of dreams. Dallas could no longer contain her. She would soon seek out Los Angeles, dragging husband and daughter along, convinced that only there could she become the woman she had already rehearsed in mirrors and in her imagination. Before leaving, she continued to sharpen her tools of allure. She dyed her hair blonde, though she would later experiment with shades, and learned how to pose for maximum effect. Friends and acquaintances recall that she could light up a room by entering it, not through accident, but through deliberate choice. Jayne understood even then that presence is crafted, not given. Every tilt of the head, every arch of the brow, every sparkle in the eye, these were rehearsals, silent lessons in the art of being noticed. But attention is a double-edged blade. To seek it is to invite scrutiny, and to cultivate it is to risk losing oneself beneath it. Did she sense the danger? Or was she too young, too filled with certainty, to imagine that the very quality she sharpened would one day cut her down? These questions linger, unanswered, like shadows beneath the bright Texan sun. As she moved toward adulthood, the train whistle of destiny grew louder. It was the sound of departure, of journeys yet to be taken. She had chosen her path, though perhaps she did not yet realize how much it would demand of her. When she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she no longer saw only a girl from Texas. She saw a star in waiting, a woman on the threshold of fame, one who believed the world must eventually notice her, no matter how long she had to wait. The scene closes upon her standing at a station, luggage at her side, the faint cry of her child in the distance, and the sharp, mournful whistle of a train cutting through the night air. The wheels are turning, the ground is trembling, and the horizon is pulling her onward. The train whistle still hangs in the night air, its cry carrying Jayne Mansfield from the wide stillness of Texas into the unknown promise of elsewhere. The wheels that turned beneath her feet did not merely bear her across miles, but carried her into the first true crossroads of her young life, where love, poverty, and ambition met in uneasy harmony. She had with her a husband, Paul Mansfield, steady but unremarkable, and a baby girl whose tiny hands clutched at the future as innocently as they clutched at her mother's hair. In this trinity of family there lay comfort, but for Jayne, comfort was never enough. The train drew her closer to Hollywood, even if she did not yet have the means, the connections, or the certainty of arrival. Her early years of marriage were a tangle of tenderness and strain. She adored her daughter, and her devotion to the child was never in question. Photographs from those days reveal a young mother cradling her infant with genuine warmth, her eyes alight not with glamour, but with maternal pride. Yet behind the gentleness, another force stirred restlessly. Paul hoped for a conventional life, with the rhythm of work and family, while Jayne gazed beyond their doorstep toward a city glowing with imagined lights. How often must he have watched her eyes drift away, even as she sat beside him, her thoughts already rehearsing lines, her mind already stepping onto stages she had yet to find. Poverty shadowed them in those early years. When they moved to Los Angeles, believing it to be the gateway to destiny, they found instead a city crowded with others chasing the same dream. Hollywood was not a golden palace that welcomed all who came. It was a fortress, and only the most cunning or the most fortunate could scale its walls. Jayne, with her child and her husband, was not yet either. They scraped together what little money they could. Paul finding odd jobs, Jayne experimenting with modeling and small auditions. Often she returned home with rejection, the faces of casting directors already weary of countless hopefuls. Yet even in rejection, she cultivated resilience. She refused to abandon the dream, even as rent bills stacked and cupboards ran bare. There is a kind of strength in those years that history rarely records. Before the headlines, before the glossy images of her wrapped in furs or stepping out of convertibles, there was the quiet perseverance of a young woman rehearsing lines late at night, rocking her child to sleep with one arm while memorizing dialogue with the other. One can almost hear the sound, the rustle of discarded audition papers on the floor, mingling with the soft cry of her infant daughter. Such were the sounds of her early pursuit, not the roar of applause, but the delicate, fragile notes of a dream struggling to survive in the dark. The tensions between Jayne and Paul deepened as the years passed. His patience wore thin as her ambitions grew larger. He wanted stability. She wanted stardom. He saw in her a wife. She saw in herself a starlet in waiting. The rift widened, though they remained bound by love for their child and by the inertia of youth. There is tragedy in this, for both of them were still so young, caught between the expectations of family life and the restless pull of dreams. How many evenings did they argue in hushed tones, careful not to wake the baby, one pleading for ordinary contentment, the other whispering of destiny. Even as their marriage strained, Jayne found small footholds. She studied acting more seriously, attending classes where she learned to project her voice, to sharpen her presence, to wield her beauty as a tool rather than a burden. Teachers noted her eagerness, though some also noted her tendency toward exaggeration, the beginnings of the persona that would later both make and undo her. For Jayne seemed to understand instinctively that Hollywood rewarded not subtlety, but spectacle. In an era where archetypes reigned, she sensed that to stand out she would need to be larger than life, a character even off-screen. The years of struggle were also years of transformation. Photographs from her early 20s reveal a young woman beginning to shape herself into something distinct, experimenting with hairstyles, with clothing, with posture. She was sculpting not only her body but her identity, molding Vera Jane Palmer into Jayne Mansfield. The name itself seemed to shimmer with promise, easier on the lips, bolder in its cadence. Was this reinvention a mask, or was it a revelation of who she had always longed to be? Perhaps both. For in creating Jayne Mansfield, she was also burying fragments of Vera, the small-town girl who once played piano in Texas halls. Her first small breaks came through modeling, where her voluptuous figure quickly drew notice. She posed for magazines, promotional campaigns, anything that would bring her closer to the screen. The attention she gained was not yet the kind of fame she dreamed of, but it was a step. And Jayne understood the value of each step. She leaned into it, experimenting with bold poses, daring outfits, cultivating the aura of a woman who could not be ignored. In these early shoots, one can already see the foreshadowing of the persona that would later both captivate and scandalize America. Paul watched uneasily as his wife drifted further from the role of quiet homemaker. The marriage began to fray under the strain of her ambition and his disillusionment. Yet through it all, Jayne clung to her daughter as the anchor of her life, refusing to let the turbulence of adult conflict dim the tenderness of motherhood. That duality, the devoted mother and the provocative star, would define her public image for years to come, though few would ever truly reconcile the two. It is tempting to see these years as mere prologue, the necessary struggle before fame. But they are more than that. They reveal a truth about Jayne Mansfield that is easy to overlook. She was not handed her stardom. She pursued it relentlessly through rejection, through poverty, through the collapse of her first marriage. She willed herself into being, shaping her destiny with equal measures of desire and defiance. And yet one cannot help but ask, at what cost? Was the seed of tragedy already sown in these early years, in the choice to place ambition above stability, in the resolve to sculpt herself into a persona that could never quite be separated from the woman within? History cannot answer. It only leaves us with the sound of a baby's cry mingling with the rustle of audition papers, and the image of a young mother staring at a mirror, torn between love and longing, between the life she had and the life she believed awaited her. The door closes softly on that small apartment, leaving behind the echoes of struggle and determination. Outside, the streets of Los Angeles beckon with neon signs and the hum of traffic, promising both wonder and disappointment. The journey is only beginning, and Jayne is stepping into the night, her shadow stretching long and uncertain. The door closes softly on that small apartment, leaving behind the muted cries of her infant and the rustle of papers strewn across the floor. Beyond that door waits the city, restless and glowing, its neon signs shimmering like stars drawn down to earth. For Jayne Mansfield, each step into the Los Angeles night carried her further from the role of dutiful wife and closer to the identity she was fashioning with relentless intent. She was no longer merely Vera Jane Palmer of Pennsylvania or the young bride of Texas. She was learning, rehearsing, shaping herself into Jayne Mansfield, a name that would one day ignite marquees and fill gossip columns with feverish speculation. The transformation did not occur in a single stroke. It was a gradual unveiling, 1,000 small gestures that together created a new image. She began by refining her appearance. Mirrors became her constant companions, reflecting not only the curve of her body or the set of her smile, but the persona she tested day after day. She experimented with hair color, eventually settling into a shade of blonde that echoed Hollywood's reigning queens, yet carried her own playful exaggeration. Clothing became a language through which she announced herself to the world. Tight sweaters that accentuated her figure, dresses that shimmered under camera lights, accessories chosen not for subtlety, but for spectacle. Every detail became a stitch in the costume of Jayne Mansfield. Her forays into modeling were the first public glimpses of this persona. Photographers drawn to her voluptuous form and bold presence began to feature her in promotional shoots. These early images reveal a woman unafraid of attention, leaning into it, daring it to grow brighter. She seemed to understand instinctively that in a city crowded with hopefuls, only those who burned brightest, whether by talent, beauty, or sheer audacity, would be seen. And so she cultivated brightness as though it were her very lifeblood. Yet the city was unkind to countless dreamers, and Jayne faced rejection after rejection in her pursuit of acting roles. Casting directors often dismissed her as too much, too curvaceous, too flamboyant, too young to balance her beauty with gravitas. But Jayne did not retreat. Instead, she studied harder, attending acting classes, absorbing lessons in voice and presence. She was determined to be seen not merely as a body, but as a performer, though she also understood that the body was a tool, one she could wield with precision. This tension between mind and flesh would haunt her career, as Hollywood seemed intent on reducing her to the latter, while she quietly longed to prove the former. It was in this period that her marriage to Paul strained beyond repair. He could not reconcile the quiet domesticity he desired with the spectacle she was becoming. Each photo shoot, each audition, each late night spent chasing opportunity widened the gulf between them. Jayne, torn between the security of family and the pull of destiny, leaned toward the latter. Divorce became inevitable, a rupture that left scars yet also freed her to pursue her ambitions without apology. One can almost hear the echo of that door closing once more, this time on her marriage, a sound both liberating and sorrowful. The years in Los Angeles shaped not only her career, but also her philosophy of fame. She began to see publicity not as a byproduct of success, but as a path to it. If she could not yet conquer Hollywood through roles, she could conquer it through presence. She appeared at events in daring gowns, posed for photographers in ways that pushed boundaries, and embraced the attention of tabloids with a boldness that others shunned. In doing so, she blurred the line between performance and life, becoming a spectacle both on and off the stage. This was the beginning of what would later define her as a star, her mastery of the publicity stunt. Jayne seemed to understand that fame in mid-century America was not given, but manufactured, and she took it upon herself to manufacture it. She courted controversy, allowed whispers to grow into rumors, and used every photograph, every headline, every gasp of scandal as another brick in the monument of her persona. To some, this was shamelessness. To Jayne, it was strategy. Still, beneath the bright surface lay a quieter truth. She longed for recognition of her craft, not only her curves. She dreamed of playing Shakespeare, of taking on serious roles that would showcase her intelligence and depth. But Hollywood, relentless in its pursuit of archetypes, had already cast her in another mold. The blonde bombshell, the successor to Marilyn Monroe. To resist this mold was to risk obscurity. To embrace it was to risk becoming a parody. Jayne, perhaps believing she could balance both, leaned into the archetype while whispering to herself that one day she would break free. Whether she truly believed that day would come remains uncertain. It is in these early transformations that we see the duality that would define her legacy. On one hand, she was a woman of agency, crafting her own image with ingenuity and resolve. On the other, she was a prisoner of an industry that rewarded her for exaggerating herself into a caricature. Was she laughing at the world with her playful poses, or was the world laughing at her? the question hangs unanswered, a tension that followed her through every stage of her career. Imagine her, late at night, alone in front of a mirror. The room is dim, the only light the soft glow of a lamp. She applies makeup with careful strokes, adjusts her hair, studies the way her eyes catch the light. She smiles, then frowns, then smiles again, experimenting with expressions as though each were a mask. Behind her, the shadows stretch across the walls, silent witnesses to her transformation. In that moment, she is both creator and creation, sculptor and sculpture, rehearsing not for a single audition, but for a lifetime of performance. And so, as the mirror reflects not one, but two faces, the fading girl of Texas and the emerging woman of Hollywood, Jayne Mansfield steps further into her destiny. The duality remains unresolved, the two faces flickering like overlapping images, neither fully eclipsing the other. It is this duality that makes her story not merely one of glamour, but of tragedy. For no woman can live forever as two people at once. The image lingers, a mirror in a quiet room reflecting both a dream and its cost, both the girl and the woman she is becoming. The mirror still holds that double image, the girl and the woman, the dream and the cost, as though the glass itself were uncertain which face to reflect. When Jayne Mansfield stepped away from it, she carried both identities into the world, but the one that the city chose to see was already predetermined. Hollywood was a place of archetypes, where actors were often cast less as individuals than as symbols, embodiments of fantasies that shimmered on screen and lingered in the imagination of audiences. And for Jayne, that archetype was clear. She would be the blonde, the bombshell, the rival to Marilyn Monroe. By the mid-1950s, Marilyn's reign was unshakable. Her blend of innocence and sensuality, her breathless voice and vulnerable charm had made her not only a star, but a cultural phenomenon. Studios, always eager to replicate success, sought others who could carry the same allure. Jayne, with her golden hair, exaggerated curves, and instinct for spectacle, seemed a natural heir. The comparisons began early, whispered in casting rooms and splashed across magazines. Jayne did little to resist them, perhaps believing that to align herself with Monroe was to step into the light, even if it meant becoming a shadow. Yet shadows have their own life. Jayne leaned into the role, amplifying the qualities that set her apart. Where Marilyn was subtle, Jayne was bold. Where Marilyn offered vulnerability, Jayne offered exaggeration. She cultivated an image so overtly glamorous, so deliberately outrageous, that it sometimes veered into parody. But behind the laughter and the shock lay strategy. Jayne understood that in a city of countless hopefuls, being subtle was a way to vanish. She chose instead to be unforgettable. Publicity became her weapon. She staged appearances designed not only to be noticed, but to be remembered. At premieres, she would wear dresses cut so daringly that they defied the boundaries of decency. At parties, she positioned herself where photographers could not ignore her. When others demurred, she leaned forward. When others whispered, she laughed loudly. In one of her most famous stunts, she arranged to have her picture taken with Sophia Loren, deliberately leaning so that her plunging neckline stole the photograph. The image traveled across the world, searing itself into the cultural memory. Was this shamelessness, or was it genius? Perhaps both, for Jayne knew that scandal was often the most direct path to stardom. But the constant comparisons to Marilyn Monroe were both blessing and curse. On one hand, they ensured that Jayne was always in the public eye, a living echo of America's most beloved star. On the other, they ensured she was rarely seen as herself. Critics dismissed her as an imitation. Audiences struggled to separate the two, and Jayne herself grew caught in the impossible task of living as both rival and original. Did she truly believe she could outshine Monroe, or was she simply willing to ride the beam of light that Monroe's fame had cast, even if it left her in shadow? The answer lies somewhere between ambition and resignation. Her acting career began to gain traction in this period, though rarely in the roles she desired. She longed for serious parts, for the chance to prove her talent beyond her body, but studios saw only the bombshell. She was cast in comedies, in roles that emphasized her figure and her flirtatious persona. Yet within those limitations, she often delivered performances with wit and timing, demonstrating a comedic intelligence that critics sometimes overlooked. In Will, Success Spoil Rock Hunter, and The Girl Can't Help It, she became both a parody and an embodiment of the very image Hollywood had sculpted for her. Audiences laughed, often at her expense, but Jayne laughed too, perhaps with a sharper awareness than most realized. The paradox of her life deepened. She was famous yet not respected, adored yet mocked, visible everywhere, yet rarely seen for who she was. In interviews, she often displayed her intelligence, speaking of philosophy, literature, and her facility with languages. But these moments were quickly dismissed by journalists eager to maintain the image of the dizzy blonde. The world preferred her as a caricature, and Jayne, needing the fame, continued to provide it. How painful must it have been to know that behind the mask of laughter and curves lay a woman who longed to be understood differently. And yet she chose, time after time, to tighten the mask, for without it the audience might vanish altogether. Her rivalry with Monroe was as much invention as reality, fueled by studios and tabloids hungry for stories. The two rarely crossed paths, and when they did, there was no open enmity. Yet the public, fascinated by comparisons, made of them a mythic pairing, the goddess and her challenger. In the shadows of that myth, Jayne's individuality was lost. She became not Jayne Mansfield, but the other blonde, forever measured against a standard she could neither escape nor fully embody. The tragedy of this rivalry lies in its inevitability. In a culture that crowned one blonde as goddess, there could be no true second place. Still, Jayne pressed forward. She believed, perhaps rightly, that fame itself was power, even if it came wrapped in ridicule. She built her pink palace, a mansion that shimmered with eccentric decoration, painting even the swimming pool in shades of pink. She became a constant presence in the press, her every outing photographed, her every word dissected. She had become what she always wanted to be, unforgettable. Yet whether she was unforgettable as an actress, a woman, or merely as a spectacle remained unresolved. The laughter that followed her was ambiguous. Some laughed with delight, some with mockery, some with both. And Jayne, always smiling, always tilting her head just so, seemed to laugh as well. Was she laughing at herself, or was she laughing at the world, playing along with its shallow expectations while secretly knowing she was more? The question drifts unanswered, like the echo of applause in an empty theater. The image remains, Jayne standing before flashing cameras, her smile fixed, her eyes wide, her dress daring, her presence undeniable. Behind her, in some invisible shadow, lingers the figure of Marilyn Monroe, a comparison that would never release her. The echoes of laughter swirl around her like a storm, some cruel, some adoring. And within that storm, Jayne stands, both radiant and trapped, her own laughter lost in the roar. The echoes of laughter still swirl, rising and falling like the tide, some cruel, some adoring, their sound mingling with the sharp white bursts of camera flashes. To stand in that storm was to live both illuminated and blinded, and Jayne Mansfield learned to make the storm her home. The stunts she performed, the moments of scandal she orchestrated, were not accidents of chance, but deliberate offerings, crafted with the care of an artist working in a peculiar medium. Where others courted modesty, she courted spectacle. Where others shrank from controversy, she welcomed it, molding it into currency. Fame, she seemed to know, was not merely bestowed but manufactured, and she would become one of its most industrious manufacturers. Her understanding of publicity bordered on genius. She did not simply appear at events, she made them unforgettable. One of her favorite tools was fashion, dresses designed to provoke as much as to adorn. Plunging necklines, gowns that shimmered with sequins, outfits calculated to defy the expectations of polite society. These became her armor and her weapon. At premieres, she ensured the photographer's attention would always be hers. At parties, she positioned herself so that her presence could not be ignored. It was not enough to attend. She had to dominate, to overshadow, to transform the mundane into the memorable. Perhaps her most infamous stunt unfolded at a dinner in 1957 when she posed beside Sophia Loren, the Italian actress then celebrated for her beauty and sophistication. Jayne leaned forward in a low-cut dress, ensuring that every photographer's lens would capture not only her presence, but the undeniable spectacle of her cleavage. The resulting photograph, Sophia glancing sideways with an expression of amused disapproval, traveled the globe. Newspapers and magazines delighted in the image. Readers debated its impropriety, and Jayne became, for better or worse, unforgettable. Was she embarrassed, as some suggested, or did she quietly laugh at having outshone one of Europe's greatest stars without saying a word? These stunts carried a price. Respectability was seldom extended to women who chose audacity over modesty. Critics dismissed her as vulgar, tabloids turned her into a caricature, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Yet Jayne seemed unfazed, as though she had accepted the terms of her bargain with fame, that she would be adored not for subtlety, but for spectacle. And perhaps, in her private heart, she believed that one day the spectacle would be a bridge to serious roles, that laughter would one day give way to applause of a different kind. The world she shocked was not prepared for a woman who wielded her sexuality so openly. In the 1950s, America was draped in a veneer of conservatism, where polite society clung to propriety while secretly fascinated by its undoing. Jayne became the embodiment of this contradiction, a woman who exposed what others only whispered. Was she liberating or was she exploited? Was she mocking the restraints of her time or reinforcing them by playing into men's fantasies? The truth may lie in both directions, for Jayne's persona was both a weapon of her own making and a cage built by the gaze of others. Her daring was not confined to clothing and photographs. She courted headlines in countless ways, from walking her dog dyed pink to matching her Cadillac to the rosy hues of her mansion. Reporters knew that wherever Jayne went, a story would follow, and she was more than willing to provide it. Some of these stories were playful, others risque, and a few edged into scandal. She posed nude for magazines, both in Europe and in America, stirring debates that only increased her fame. She allowed photographers into her home, showcasing the Pink Palace as though it were a stage set designed for a never-ending performance. Life itself became theater, and Jayne its most flamboyant actress. Yet behind the spectacle was a woman who, by all accounts, remained affectionate, warm, and deeply devoted to her children. She played with them in the gardens of her Pink Palace, carried them into photographs, and spoke of them with tenderness in interviews. This duality, scandalous star and nurturing mother, only added to the fascination. How could the woman who provoked outrage also be the woman who read bedtime stories and baked cakes? Perhaps the answer lies in the refusal to accept that a woman must be one thing only. Perhaps Jayne's greatest rebellion was her insistence on being both. Still, the laughter lingered, and Jayne bore its weight. To some, she was an object of ridicule, a cartoon drawn in flesh. To others, she was a goddess of daring, unafraid to embrace what others suppressed. And to herself, we cannot know with certainty. Did she lie awake at night, pondering whether the world saw her or only her image? Did she ever wonder if the headlines that proclaimed her daring also obscured the woman she longed to reveal? The silence of history leaves us with questions more than answers. And perhaps it is in the questions that her humanity is most visible. Her stunts reached their peak in this period, each one escalating, each one demanding to outshine the last. But the storm of attention, once welcomed, began to show its cracks. Publicity can build, but it can also consume. A persona so exaggerated risks becoming a parody, and a parody is difficult to escape. Jayne's challenge, which would haunt her until the end, was how to balance the spectacle with the woman, how to remain unforgettable without being dismissed. It is a paradox with no resolution, a paradox that perhaps defined not only Jayne Mansfield, but all who walk the treacherous path of fame. The image lingers, a sudden burst of light from a camera, freezing her smile in time. Around her, the air smells of perfume and champagne. The sound of laughter echoes from unseen mouths. And in the center stands Jayne, dazzling yet shadowed, triumphant yet vulnerable. The camera flash fades, but the after-image remains, burned into the eyes of the world, a spectacle that cannot be forgotten. The after-image of that camera flash still lingers, its glow imprinting itself on the eyes, even as the room itself returns to darkness. Jayne Mansfield stood at the heart of that glow, a spectacle born of daring, and yet she hungered for more than photographs and laughter. Publicity could keep her name alive, but it was the cinema that promised immortality. To be captured not in fleeting newsprint, but on reels of film meant a chance to outlast the gossip and the sneers, a chance to carve a place alongside those stars she had once gazed upon as a girl in Texas. And so, in the mid-1950s, the spectacle she had so carefully cultivated opened doors that persistence alone might never have unlocked. Her first roles were small, appearances in films and television shows that allowed her beauty to be noticed, but rarely her talent. She was cast as secretaries, chorus girls, bit players whose presence was meant to decorate rather than define a scene. Yet even in these fragments of performance, her charisma seemed impossible to contain. There was an energy in the way she moved, an awareness of the camera's gaze, as though she had been born to fill the frame. Directors and producers began to take notice, and soon the opportunities grew larger. The year 1956 marked the turning point with The Girl Can't Help It, a film that placed Jayne at the center of its story and allowed her image to be projected across the globe. The film, directed by Frank Tashlin, was ostensibly a comedy, a satire of the very archetype Jayne had come to embody. She played Jerry Jordan, the girlfriend of a gangster who longs not to be a starlet, but a housewife. Yet in the irony of the role lay its brilliance. Jayne, already branded by the world as the exaggerated blonde Bombshell, was now portraying a character who resisted fame even as it consumed her. Audiences laughed at the spectacle, but beneath the humor was a quiet reflection of Jayne's own tension, the push and pull between public persona and private longing. The film was a success, celebrated not only for Jayne's performance, but also for its vibrant embrace of the new rock and roll culture. Featuring performances by Little Richard, Fats Domino, and the Platters, it captured the shifting tides of American entertainment. And Jayne stood at the center, embodying both the glamour of old Hollywood and the boldness of the new age. For the first time, she was not simply a woman in the background, but the star of the picture, her name emblazoned above the title, her image carried on posters across the nation. With fame came adoration. Fans flocked to see her, enchanted by her playful manner, her exaggerated gestures, her blend of innocence and provocation. She signed autographs, posed for photographs, and basked in the applause that had once been only an imagined sound in the quiet of her teenage room. Yet even as applause filled theaters, a quieter echo remained. When the clapping ceased and the lights dimmed, what was left for her? Was she recognized as an actress or merely as a spectacle transplanted from the gossip columns onto the screen? Her next notable role came in Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, also directed by Tashlin, adapted from a Broadway play but transformed into a satire of advertising, consumerism, and the cult of celebrity. Once again, Jayne played a parody of herself, a glamorous actress whose persona is both irresistible and absurd. Critics noted her comedic timing, her ability to laugh at her own image, and some even praised her intelligence in embracing a role that mocked the very archetype she was forced to inhabit. Yet the paradox deepened. By parodying herself, she gained both recognition and ridicule, as though the world could not decide whether to laugh with her or at her. For a brief time, her fame blazed at its brightest. She attended premieres with the assurance of a true star, appeared on magazine covers as frequently as Monroe, and commanded salaries that testified to her bankability. She won a Golden Globe as Most Promising Newcomer, an award that seemed to confirm her arrival. The dream she had rehearsed in mirrors and whispers was now a reality. And yet, even in triumph, shadows lingered. Hollywood was fickle, and the very excess that had made her unforgettable threatened to confine her to a narrow box from which she could not escape. Jayne's relationship with fame was like fire. It warmed her, illuminated her, and allowed her to be seen. But it also burned, and she could not always control the flames. In interviews, she sometimes tried to assert her intelligence, speaking of her fluency in languages, her interest in classical music, her serious study of acting. Yet these revelations were often met with amusement, as though the world refused to believe that a woman with such curves could also carry such thoughts. Her mind was dismissed, her voice unheard, and the laughter grew louder. And still she smiled. On set, she brought energy and playfulness, often delighting crews with her humor. Off set, she played the role of the star with unwavering commitment, greeting fans, arranging photo opportunities, and staging her life as though it were a performance. Perhaps she believed that by leaning fully into the persona, she could one day break free of it, or perhaps she accepted that the persona had already consumed the woman beneath. The ambiguity remains, as unresolved as the double image in her mirror. One can imagine her at the height of her fame, stepping into a theater filled with expectant audiences. The lights dim, the projector hums, and her face fills the screen, larger than life, her voice echoing through the darkened hall. For 90 minutes she is not merely a woman, but a dream, a constellation of desire and laughter, adored by strangers she will never meet. When the credits roll and the applause fades, she leaves the theater to step into a limousine, the night air heavy with perfume and cigarette smoke, the distant hum of Hollywood still buzzing in her ears. In that moment, was she content? Or did she already sense that fame, like the applause, fades quickly, leaving only silence behind? The image fades, applause still ringing faintly, echoing down corridors now empty, until only the quiet remains. And in that quiet, a dressing room sits empty, its lights still glowing around the mirror, a faint trace of perfume lingering in the air, but no figure to inhabit it. The dressing room remains empty, its bulbs glowing softly around the mirror, perfume lingering in the silence, as though waiting for a figure who has already slipped away. Applause fades quickly once the curtain falls, and in the hollowness that follows, one often hears the truer sounds of life, sighs, whispers, the faint echo of loneliness that no audience can fill. For Jayne Mansfield, whose laughter on screen and in photographs seemed boundless, the private silences told another story. Behind the applause lay the strain of a marriage unraveling, the tender ache of loss, and the growing weight of carrying both her children and her fame on shoulders not yet steady. Her union with Paul Mansfield, already strained by her ambitions and his desire for ordinary stability, could not survive the demands of Hollywood. The bright lights that illuminated her career cast shadows over their domestic life, and those shadows deepened with each passing year. Paul, unwilling to play the role of supporting character in her pursuit of stardom, grew distant. Jayne, unwilling to compromise her ascent, continued to push forward, her heart torn between devotion to her daughter and devotion to her dream. In 1958, their divorce was finalized, a quiet conclusion to a story that had begun with the innocence of teenage love. Divorce, even when necessary, carries its own grief. Jayne, though determined to press on, must have felt the sting of failure, the breaking apart of the family she had once built with youthful hope. She remained deeply connected to her daughter, Jayne Marie, whose presence grounded her amidst the chaos. But even as she rocked her child in moments of tenderness, the whispers of tabloids and the relentless gaze of the public intruded. Could she be both mother and star? Could she nurture a child while the world demanded she nurture only her image? These questions hovered like shadows she could never quite dispel. In the midst of this fracture, new love arrived in the form of Mickey Hargitay, the Hungarian-born bodybuilder whose sculpted physique had won him the title of Mr. Universe. He met Jayne in 1956 when she attended one of his nightclub performances. Their attraction was immediate, a collision of spectacle meeting spectacle, his strength and her glamour forming a union that seemed made for headlines. To the public, they appeared as a perfect pair, the blonde bombshell and the muscle-bound Adonis, a living postcard of beauty and power. They married in 1958, not long after Jayne's divorce from Paul was complete, and the photographs of their wedding adorned magazines worldwide. Yet even in this glamorous pairing, turbulence stirred beneath the surface. Mickey adored Jayne and often supported her with devotion, but he, too, was drawn into the whirlwind of her fame, a whirlwind that left little space for privacy or peace. Their home became a theater, their love a stage play performed for cameras. Jayne's desire for attention, her endless courting of publicity, often strained their marriage. Mickey, though strong in body, found himself tested by the storm that was his wife's pursuit of immortality. Still, their years together produced moments of tenderness and joy. They had 3 children, Miklos, Zoltan, and Mariska, whom Jayne loved fiercely. The house, despite its spectacle, echoed with the laughter of children, and Jayne, whatever else the world said of her, was a mother who never abandoned her devotion to them. Yet even as she tucked her little ones into bed, the noise of fame clamored at the windows, demanding her presence on sets, at premieres, in nightclubs, in photographs. The duality that had always defined her life, the mother and the star, grew more pronounced, more difficult to reconcile. Her loneliness deepened as her relationships fractured. Hollywood was not a place that nurtured marriage, it was a place that devoured it. The demands of constant performance, the temptation of infidelity, the ceaseless travel, all eroded the bonds of intimacy. Jayne, for all her laughter, was not immune to these strains. Arguments flared, separations occurred, reconciliations faltered, and slowly the love story with Mickey lost its shine. The tabloids, ever hungry, recorded every stumble, turning private pain into public amusement. How heavy must it have been to carry heartbreak not in silence, but under the eyes of a million strangers. And yet she continued to smile. Publicly, she was still the blonde star, playful, daring, impossible to ignore. Privately, she wrestled with solitude, with the ache of dreams deferred, with the knowledge that her heart's desire, to be taken seriously as an actress, remained elusive. The roles offered to her rarely matched her ambitions, and the decline of her marriage mirrored the decline of her career's trajectory. The 1960s were dawning, bringing with them new styles, new icons, new voices. Jayne, though still luminous, began to sense the shifting winds. Imagine her, late at night, alone in her pink palace, the children asleep upstairs, the house quiet but for the faint hum of Los Angeles beyond. She pours herself a drink, perhaps, and sits by the window gazing at the city lights. She remembers the applause, the laughter, the camera flashes. She remembers, too, the arguments, the slammed doors, the tears shed in silence. Did she ever wonder if the dream was worth the cost? Did she imagine, even for a moment, a life where she had chosen stability over spectacle, where she remained Jane Palmer of Texas, a school teacher perhaps, rather than Jayne Mansfield of Hollywood? The world would not allow her such musings for long. Morning would come. Cameras would return, and she would once again don the smile that had carried her so far. Yet in those fleeting hours of solitude, she may have felt the weight of both her triumphs and her losses pressing upon her. The laughter of children upstairs, the echo of applause long faded, the quiet hum of a city that never truly slept, all merging into the sound of a woman both celebrated and unseen. The image lingers, a door closing softly in the night, shutting out the noise of the world, leaving behind only silence, a silence filled not with peace, but with the ache of absence. The door closes softly in the night, shutting out the noise of the world, leaving only silence. Yet even silence in the Pink Palace was never long-lived. Within its walls, love and quarrels, laughter and weeping, applause and arguments blended together into a music all their own. Jayne Mansfield, though adored by audiences, found the private stages of her life more turbulent than any film role. The applause of strangers could not shield her from the storms of passion that defined her marriages, storms that rose quickly with intensity and often left wreckage in their wake. Her marriage to Mickey Hargitay seemed, at first, to be a union made in some celestial theater. He, the strong man from Hungary, chiseled like a statue, whose past victories in bodybuilding competitions had crowned him Mr. Universe. She, the golden-haired starlet, whose curves and laughter were known to millions. Together they looked less like a couple than a myth brought to life. The god of strength and the goddess of glamour, striding through Hollywood as though Olympus had descended upon Los Angeles. Photographers adored them, magazines celebrated them, and the world saw in their union a fairy tale. Yet fairy tales, when lived, are seldom simple. Mickey, despite his strength, was unprepared for the full force of Jayne's pursuit of fame. She was not content merely to be admired. She sought to orchestrate admiration at every turn. Publicity was her daily bread, and she consumed it hungrily. For a time, Mickey followed willingly, standing beside her in photographs, playing the devoted husband who shared the stage. But a life lived as constant theater wears heavily upon love. Arguments flared, often over her need for spectacle, her daring stunts, her relentless demand for the world's attention. Mickey, though no stranger to performance himself, longed for a simpler devotion, one not always staged beneath the glare of cameras. Their quarrels, like their love, were passionate. Neighbors recalled voices raised, doors slammed, reconciliations fierce and tender. Their children, Miklos, Zoltan, and Mariska, were born into this tempest, loved fiercely by both parents, yet raised in a home where the boundaries between love and conflict blurred daily. Jayne, ever the devoted mother, tried to shield them from the worst of it, filling their lives with affection, stories, and play. But even children sense the turbulence that swirls around them, and the Pink Palace, with all its extravagance, was also a house of storms. Jayne's love for Mickey did not fade quickly. Their passion, whether an embrace or an argument, testified to a bond that could not be easily severed. But passion without peace is seldom sustainable. By the mid-1960s, their marriage had grown weary. Rumors of infidelity, separations, and reconciliations played out not in private, but in the public eye. For the tabloids recorded each fracture as gleefully as they had once celebrated the union. By 1964, the marriage had ended in divorce. Another dream unraveled, another scar upon Jayne's already tender heart. Yet Jayne was not one to linger in sorrow. Her life moved always forward, restless, hungry for both love and attention. In 1964, she married Matt Cimber, a director she had met through the world of theater. This marriage, though briefer and less mythologized, carried its own intensity. Matt, younger and ambitious, was drawn to Jayne's star power, and she to his creative energy. They had one child together, Antonio, and for a time Jayne seemed to hope that stability might finally be hers. But stability was a dream that eluded her. The marriage with Matt quickly descended into turbulence, marred by quarrels and accusations. Jayne, though still luminous, was no longer at the peak of her career. Roles grew scarce, nightclubs replaced studios, and financial strain gnawed at her once lavish life. The Pink Palace, though still vibrant in its eccentric beauty, was costly to maintain. Matt, unable or unwilling to bear the chaos that surrounded her, grew distant, and their union dissolved after only a few years. By 1966, another divorce was finalized, leaving Jayne with 5 children, fragments of broken marriages, and a heart both wounded and unyielding. What is it, one wonders, that drew Jayne again and again into such storms of love? Was it the absence of her father in childhood, leaving her always searching for the anchor of a man's presence? Was it the hunger for affection that could match the adoration of the crowd, a longing for intimacy that fame could never satisfy? Or was it simply that she lived life with such intensity that love, for her, could never be calm, only fierce, only all-consuming? These questions linger, and in them lies the poignancy of her story. Yet through each heartbreak, her devotion to her children never faltered. She carried them with her from marriages to tours, from nightclubs to photo shoots, determined that they remain close despite the chaos. Photographs from those years showed Jayne surrounded by her children, her arms full, her smile genuine in their presence. Whatever else might be said of her, she was not a mother who abandoned. In their laughter, she found a refuge from the storm, a quietness of love untainted by ambition or scandal. Still, the turbulence of her personal life bled into her public image. The tabloids, ever eager for scandal, painted her as reckless, unstable, a woman unable to keep her loves or her life in order. The laughter that once greeted her stunts now grew edged with cruelty. The world, which had once celebrated her boldness, began to mock her excess. And Jayne, though wounded, smiled still, tilting her head to the cameras, baring her teeth in the grin that had carried her through so much. But behind the smile lay exhaustion, and perhaps a quiet sorrow that the love she gave so freely so often dissolved into conflict. The sound remains, champagne glasses clinking together at some Hollywood gathering, raised in celebration of love newly found or love desperately maintained. The glasses ring clear, but beneath their fragile music lies the uncertainty of how long before they will be set down, half-filled, forgotten, another toast already forgotten in the endless theater of Jayne's life. The champagne glasses remain on the table, half-filled, their sparkle dulled as the bubbles fade and the liquid grows still. They stand as relics of a fleeting celebration, fragments of joy suspended in time, much like the life of Jayne Mansfield herself, bright in the moment, uncertain in its endurance. From these abandoned toasts, the gaze drifts to the place that held her greatest spectacle, a house that was not merely a home, but a monument to her dreams, the Pink Palace. Perched on Sunset Boulevard in Holmby Hills, the Pink Palace was Jayne's kingdom, a mansion painted entirely in shades of blush, from its exterior walls to the tiles of its bathroom. Purchased in the late 1950s at the height of her fame, it was less a dwelling than a stage upon which her life was endlessly performed. She decorated it in hues of rose and fuchsia, embedding her very identity into its walls so that the house itself became a reflection of her public persona. Even the swimming pool was adorned with her signature flourish, tiled at the bottom with the words, "I love you, Jayne," a message that seemed as much a plea to herself as to anyone who gazed upon it. The Pink Palace drew endless curiosity. Reporters were invited in to marvel at its eccentricities. Photographers captured its every corner, and visitors left with stories that would become legend. Its heart-shaped bed, its shag carpets, its pink fur bathroom, all spoke of excess and whimsy, of a woman who embraced fantasy as daily reality. To some, it was tasteless. To others, it was a wonderland. For Jayne, it was both sanctuary and stage, a place where she could retreat into the world she had built and also invite the world in, to marvel at her creation. Yet behind the glitter and the velvet curtains lay fragility. The house was costly to maintain, and Jayne's career, though still alive, was not always equal to its demands. Bills mounted, debts grew, and the palace, though extravagant, became a burden. Still, she clung to it, perhaps because to let it go would be to surrender the dream it represented. The Pink Palace was not simply a house. It was proof that she had ascended from the small-town girl of Texas to the icon of Hollywood, that her dream had been realized, however precariously. To lose it would be to confess defeat, and Jayne was never one to admit surrender. Inside its walls, the contradictions of her life played out daily. The laughter of children echoed through its pink hallways, mingling with the murmurs of arguments, the clicking of cameras, and the soft footsteps of lovers coming and going. Friends recalled parties where the rooms glowed with music, laughter, and spectacle. Yet they also recalled quiet evenings when Jayne wandered the halls alone, a solitary figure in a palace too large to provide true comfort. Like a fairy tale castle, it dazzled from a distance, but within it carried the weight of both enchantment and sorrow. Visitors often remarked on Jayne's warmth when welcoming them, her eagerness to play hostess, her delight in showing them every eccentric corner of her home. She seemed to revel in the astonishment it provoked, as though each gasp of surprise was applause for her ingenuity. But one wonders if, in the stillness after the guests departed, she ever felt the emptiness echoing through the cavernous rooms, the silence that even pink walls could not disguise. Was the house a reflection of her joy, or was it an attempt to cover the growing fractures within her life? The answer may be both, for beauty often serves as both revelation and disguise. The Pink Palace became inseparable from her public image. Photographs of Jayne lounging by the heart-shaped pool or reclining on her lavish bed circulated in magazines, reinforcing the image of her as Hollywood's boldest blonde, a woman unafraid of excess. The house was part of her performance, an extension of the persona she had crafted. Yet within its walls, real life persisted, children growing, marriages fracturing, bills unpaid, tears shed in solitude. The palace, like Jayne herself, was both dazzling and vulnerable, a structure that seemed indestructible, yet stood always on shaky ground. It is easy, in recalling the Pink Palace, to think of it only as spectacle, a glittering monument to vanity. But to do so is to miss the poignancy that infused its creation. For beneath the pink and the fur lay a longing, the same longing that had driven her since childhood, to be seen, to be remembered, to be loved. The house was less a boast than a plea, an invitation to the world to step into her dream and acknowledge its reality. "I love you, Jayne," the pool declared, as though reminding its owner again and again that she was worthy of love, even when the world mocked her, even when marriages dissolved, even when roles dwindled. Imagine her there on a quiet night, the house lit softly in rose hues, her children asleep upstairs. She walks barefoot through the velvet hallways, the carpets muffling her steps, a glass of wine in hand. She pauses by the pool, its water glowing faintly beneath the moonlight, the words tiled at its bottom, shimmering just beneath the surface. She gazes into the water, seeing her reflection blur and ripple, as though even here she cannot grasp herself clearly. Does she smile at the extravagance? Or does she sigh, wondering if she's built a palace not of pink, but of illusion? The Pink Palace stood for many years as her most enduring monument, a house remembered long after the lights of her fame began to dim. It was a dream realized and a dream burdened, both sanctuary and stage, both haven and prison. Within its walls, Jayne Mansfield lived not one life but many, the star, the mother, the lover, the hostess, the dreamer, and all of them left their imprint on its rose-colored walls. The candle flickers within, casting a soft pink glow against velvet drapes, a flame both delicate and stubborn. It wavers but does not yet go out, its light trembling in the still air of the palace that holds both laughter and sorrow. The candle still flickers in the velvet-draped room, its light soft against the pink walls, wavering as though uncertain of its own endurance. In that trembling flame, one may glimpse the state of Jayne Mansfield's career as the 1960s moved forward, still glowing, still warm, yet increasingly fragile, threatened by winds of change blowing through Hollywood. For just as fashion alters, so too does the appetite of audiences, and what once dazzled them may, within only a few years, seem gaudy or out of step. Jayne, who had built her fame upon exaggeration, upon daring and spectacle, now faced a culture shifting toward new ideals, new stars, and a new kind of realism. By the early 1960s, the Hollywood blonde archetype was fading. Marilyn Monroe's tragic death in 1962 had cast a shadow over the figure of the bombshell, making her successors appear almost like relics of a passing age. Audiences grew more captivated by actresses who embodied naturalism rather than parody, subtlety rather than spectacle. Figures like Audrey Hepburn, Elizabeth Taylor, and Julie Christie represented a different ideal, one rooted less in exaggerated curves and playful innuendo than in a modern sophistication. Jayne's carefully sculpted image, which once made her unforgettable, now risked making her obsolete. Roles began to dwindle. Studios that had once competed for her presence now hesitated, unsure of how to use an actress whose persona seemed frozen in another era. The scripts offered to her were often shallow imitations of the parts she had already played, comedies that repeated the same joke until it no longer provoked laughter. She continued to accept them, for she had bills to pay, children to support, and a lifestyle that demanded income. But each role, rather than elevating her, seemed to diminish her further, reinforcing the caricature instead of allowing her to escape it. Her fame, once so radiant, began to fracture into smaller fragments. She remained a popular figure in tabloids, her appearances still drawing photographers, her stunts still making headlines. But these headlines increasingly mocked rather than celebrated, casting her as a woman desperate to cling to fame rather than one naturally deserving of it. The laughter that had always followed her grew sharper, tinged with cruelty, and Jayne, though still smiling, must have felt the sting. Was the laughter ever truly with her, or had it always been at her expense? Perhaps she did not wish to answer, for to admit the latter would be to unravel the very persona she had so carefully crafted. The financial strain grew heavier. The Pink Palace, though a marvel, demanded upkeep that exceeded her means. She toured frequently, appearing in nightclub acts, stage performances, and European films, seeking any income to sustain her household. These performances, though often beneath the dignity of her talent, became her lifeline. Night after night, she stepped onto stages far smaller than the grand theaters of Hollywood, smiling before audiences who came as much out of curiosity as admiration. She sang, she joked, she danced, always giving herself fully, always determined to entertain. And yet one wonders if, in the dressing rooms afterward, she sat in silence, staring into the mirror, wondering if this was the future she had once dreamed of. Hollywood, ruthless in its cycles, rarely forgave those who slipped from its summit. Once an actress was branded a relic, opportunities dwindled further, and gossip replaced recognition. Jayne's attempts to reinvent herself often fell short, not for lack of effort, but because the image of Jayne Mansfield had become too fixed in the public mind. She was no longer allowed to surprise, no longer permitted to grow. The persona had become the prison, and still she fought. She continued to study, to rehearse, to audition, clinging to the hope that one role might rescue her from caricature. She ventured into European cinema, where filmmakers were more willing to embrace her notoriety, casting her in roles both provocative and experimental. These projects kept her name alive, yet they also reinforced the notion that she was more spectacle than actress. Audiences overseas often treated her less as a performer than as an American curiosity, a living symbol of Hollywood excess exported for their amusement. In America, meanwhile, her public image grew entangled with scandal. Rumors of affairs, of financial ruin, of bizarre flirtations with the occult circulated freely. Whether true or exaggerated, they overshadowed her work. Jayne, ever willing to court publicity, sometimes leaned into these rumors, believing that even scandal was preferable to invisibility. But each whisper, each headline, chipped away at her credibility, making it harder for her to be taken seriously. What must it feel like to sense one's light dimming while still burning with desire to shine? To be both present and fading, adored yet mocked, remembered yet misunderstood? Jayne's life in these years was filled with such contradictions. She lived in extravagance and debt, in laughter and sorrow, in visibility and invisibility. The candle flickered, sometimes bright, sometimes nearly extinguished, but always trembling in the drafts of an indifferent world. And yet, amidst decline, there were still moments of joy. Her children remained her anchor, their laughter filling the palace with a sound more precious than applause. Friends recalled her warmth, her kindness, her refusal to succumb to bitterness. She continued to love, to laugh, to dance, even when the world seemed to move on without her. Perhaps this resilience was her greatest triumph. Not the films, not the stunts, not even the pink palace, but the stubborn refusal to let despair consume her. The marquee signs that once glowed with her name now lost letters, their bulbs dimming in the wind, leaving only fragments of the promise they once carried. And still Jayne walked beneath them, head high, smile fixed, as though willing the world to remember. The sound of those fading bulbs hums in the night air, a faint buzz that echoes the fragility of fame itself, bright one moment, broken the next. The hum of those dimming marquee bulbs lingers in the night air, the faint crackle of electricity sputtering through half-broken letters that once spelled her name in full. Now, incomplete, they flicker like fragments of memory, whispering of glory that had begun to fade. And from beneath these faltering signs, Jayne Mansfield looked outward, across oceans, to new stages, where her name still carried curiosity, if not reverence. Europe beckoned, with its directors hungry for spectacle, its audiences eager for the exotic glimmer of Hollywood exported to their shores. For Jayne, these journeys across the Atlantic offered both refuge and exile, a chance to reinvent herself, while also a reminder that her place at the center of American cinema had been lost. In Italy, Germany, and the United Kingdom, she found roles, not the prestigious dramas she had once dreamed of, but films that embraced her notoriety. European producers knew her as a symbol, an American goddess of excess, and they cast her in projects that leaned heavily upon her image. Titles promised titillation, characters exaggerated her persona, and scripts seldom rose beyond the level of spectacle. Yet Jayne, practical beneath her pink glamour, accepted them. The work provided income, and the stages of Europe, however modest, still kept her name alive. These films, though often dismissed critically, carried a peculiar poignancy. Jayne, once a rising star in Hollywood comedies that mocked the archetype of the bombshell, was now performing that archetype earnestly in productions that treated her less as satire and more as sensation. It was as though the parody had become reality. The mask she once wore in jest now fused to her face. Still, she gave herself to the roles with vigor, delivering performances that revealed both her professionalism and her refusal to surrender. If Hollywood would no longer claim her, she would carry her own light abroad, even if that light flickered in smaller theaters, in languages not her own. Her travels through Europe brought new experiences, new admirers, and new challenges. Audiences there received her with fascination, not only for her films, but for the aura of Hollywood she represented. She was invited to galas, to cabaret stages, to photo shoots in grand halls where chandeliers glowed above velvet curtains. For a moment she seemed reborn, celebrated not for who she was but for what she symbolized, the embodiment of American glamour, transplanted into European soil. Yet such admiration was fragile, resting less on her artistry than on the spectacle of her presence. The stage became increasingly central to her survival. Nightclubs welcomed her as a performer, offering contracts for shows in which she sang, danced, and told playful stories. These performances were far from the Hollywood features she once commanded, but Jayne embraced them, determined to give audiences her full energy. In smoky rooms filled with clinking glasses and murmured conversations, she stepped beneath spotlights, wearing sequins that sparkled as though defying the shadows that encroached upon her career. Those who watched her often remarked upon her resilience. Even in smaller venues, even before indifferent crowds, she performed as though the world's eyes were upon her. Yet there must have been nights when, leaving the stage, she felt the weight of contrast too heavily. The applause of nightclub patrons could not echo with the same grandeur as the thunderous response of cinema audiences. The dressing rooms were smaller, the mirrors dimmer, the flowers fewer. She smiled still, she laughed still, but perhaps within her the quiet question pressed harder. Was this the dream she had once whispered to herself as a girl beneath Texan skies? Was this the fulfillment of all those rehearsals before the mirror? Financial pressures shadowed every step. The Pink Palace demanded upkeep even in her absence, and the cost of raising 5 children was immense. She traveled often, leaving her little ones in the care of others, her heart torn between necessity and devotion. Letters sent across the ocean, phone calls when possible, gifts carried home in suitcases. All were attempts to bridge the distance, to remind her children that though she was absent, she had not abandoned them. For Jayne, the role of mother was never relinquished, even as the role of star grew increasingly difficult to sustain. In Europe, too, whispers of scandal followed her. Tabloids seized upon rumors of affairs, of eccentricities, of desperate attempts to remain relevant. Some stories were exaggerated, others perhaps true, but all contributed to the growing image of Jayne as a woman slipping into parody. She had once mastered publicity with a sense of play, but now the headlines seemed less like jokes shared with the world and more like accusations leveled against her. The laughter that followed her was no longer kind, and yet there was defiance in her persistence. She refused to vanish quietly, refused to surrender her stage. Even as roles grew smaller, even as headlines mocked rather than praised, she continued to work, to travel, to smile for cameras. She wore her sequins like armor, her smile like a shield, her laughter like a weapon. Perhaps this was her truest strength, that she never allowed the world to see her broken, even when cracks spread silently beneath the surface. The ships that carried her across the Atlantic became symbols of this restless search for reinvention. Standing on the deck, watching the ocean stretch endlessly in every direction, she must have felt both exhilaration and sorrow. Exhilaration at the adventure, at the chance to once again be celebrated, to once again be seen. Sorrow at the distance, at the knowledge that she was no longer at the heart of the dream she had once pursued so fervently. The waves whispered of journeys, of cycles, of lives carried endlessly between shores. Perhaps she listened. Perhaps she let the salt air sting her eyes. Perhaps she wondered if the tides would ever carry her back to the summit she once knew. The horn of the ship sounds across the water, low and mournful, echoing into the night. It calls her onward, across the ocean, into theaters and clubs, into films half remembered and performances half forgotten. It calls her into reinvention, into persistence, into the endless effort to remain visible in a world that so quickly forgets. And in that sound lies both hope and tragedy, for it is the sound of movement without destination, of voyages that never quite arrive. The ship's horn still sounds across the dark waters, low and mournful, a call that fades into the horizon yet lingers in the ear. It is a sound of distance, of longing, of journeys never fully completed. And as Jayne Mansfield crossed oceans, chasing stages and cameras, there remained always another call, softer but stronger than any ship's voice. The call of her children. No matter how far she traveled, no matter how bright or dim the spotlight, the laughter and tears of her little ones pulled at her heart, a reminder that beneath the glittering persona and the endless performances lived a mother whose truest devotion never dimmed. Jayne was the mother of 5. Jane Marie, her eldest, born of her first marriage, carried with her the weight of being both child and witness to her mother's early struggles. Then came the children of her marriage with Mickey Hargitay, Mikolos, Zoltan, and Mariska, each of them inheriting pieces of their parents' beauty and strength. Finally, with Matt Cimber, she bore Antonio, her youngest, who arrived at a time when her life was already marked by turbulence and decline. 5 children, each a living anchor, each a reminder that amidst the storm of fame, there existed moments of tenderness untouched by scandal. In the Pink Palace, as extravagant as it was, her children found not only spectacle, but also affection. The heart-shaped pool, the velvet carpets, the endless pink. It was for them both playground and home, filled with the warmth of a mother who adored them. Jayne was known to spend hours in the garden, playing with her children among the roses, their laughter mingling with the hum of Hollywood beyond the gates. She read to them, sang to them, tucked them into bed at night with a tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the exaggerated figure she portrayed to the world. Yet the duality was always present. For as much as she adored her children, her career demanded distance. Tours carried her away for weeks, sometimes months. European films and nightclub engagements placed entire oceans between her and her little ones. In those absences, she wrote letters, made calls, sent gifts, all in an effort to bridge the gulf of geography. But gifts, however thoughtful, cannot replace presence, and Jayne, in her quiet hours, must have felt the ache of absence pressing upon her. Perhaps she wondered if the applause of strangers was ever worth the sacrifice of time, stolen from her children's growing years. Still, when she was with them, she gave herself completely. Friends who visited the Pink Palace often remarked on her warmth with her children, the way she seemed to transform from star to mother with ease. The cameras could click, the reporters could whisper. But in those moments, she was not the scandalous Jayne Mansfield. She was simply Mama, a woman whose arms were always open, whose love was never in question. There is a purity in this, a truth that no tabloid could tarnish. The children themselves carried their mother's devotion forward, each in their own way. Jayne Marie would later speak of the complexities of having a famous mother, of the contradictions between the public image and the private woman she knew. Mariska, who was only 3 when her mother died, grew into an actress herself, carrying both the burden and the blessing of that legacy. Even Zoltan and Miklos, who endured childhood marked by both privilege and scandal, spoke of her tenderness. These voices remind us that beyond the headlines, there was a woman who loved deeply, who gave of herself despite the chaos swirling around her. But motherhood, like her career, was shadowed by hardship. Her children witnessed quarrels between their parents, separations, reconciliations, and eventual divorces. They heard the whispers of scandal, saw the flash of cameras at their doorstep, lived in a house that was as much a stage as a home. What effect did this have upon them? Did they ever long for the anonymity of ordinary childhood, free from the constant intrusion of the public eye? Or did they accept, as children often do, the reality into which they were born, adapting with resilience? We cannot know fully, but their lives, shaped by both love and spectacle, testify to the complexity of growing up in the shadow of a woman, both adored and ridiculed. Jayne herself may have felt the strain most acutely in moments of quiet. Imagine her seated in a child's room, the glow of a bedside lamp illuminating her face as she reads a story aloud. The children drift into sleep, their breaths soft and even, while she lingers a moment longer, watching them. In that stillness, the noise of Hollywood fades. The Pink Palace is no longer a theater but a home, and Jayne is simply a mother, her heart full, her burdens momentarily eased. Then she rises, closing the door gently, stepping back into a world that demands her smile, her laughter, her performance. The contrast is sharp, the transition endless. It is in this devotion to her children that Jayne Mansfield's humanity shines most clearly. For though the world may remember her for scandal, for stunts, for her tragic end, her children remembered her for her embrace, her laughter, her love. Perhaps this is the truest measure of a life, not the applause of strangers, but the tenderness given to those closest. And yet the world rarely sees such truths, preferring instead the glitter and the gossip. The sound that remains now is not the hum of a crowd or the crackle of a camera flash. It is the lighter sound of children's laughter echoing through wide halls, a sound pure, fleeting, and endlessly precious. It lingers after they run outside, after their voices fade, leaving the house momentarily quiet, holding only the echo of joy. The echo of children's laughter drifts down the hallways of the Pink Palace until it fades into stillness, leaving only shadows upon the walls and the faint glow of colored lamps. In that quiet, when the house no longer hummed with innocence, Jayne Mansfield sometimes turned her gaze toward mysteries of a darker kind. For even as her life brimmed with spectacle and scandal, there were whispers of another fascination, of candles lit in secret, of whispered names, of a curiosity for the occult. These rumors, which clung to her in the mid-1960s, gave her story an additional layer of intrigue, as though the bright pink of her world concealed not only sorrow but also shadows. It was during this time that Jayne became linked to Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan in San Francisco. LaVey, with his shaved head, his theatrical robes, and his philosophy of indulgence, was himself a master of spectacle, a man who blurred the line between performance and belief. His church attracted not only the curious, but also the famous, those drawn to the allure of the forbidden, the thrill of aligning with what society considered taboo. Jayne, always eager to remain in the public eye and never afraid of scandal, found herself entangled in this circle. Photographs survive of Jayne and LaVey together, she in glamorous gowns, he in dark robes, their presence together sparking both fascination and outrage. Some claimed she became a high priestess within his church, others that their connection was no more than a publicity stunt, another calculated gesture to ensure her name remained upon the lips of the public. Which was truth and which was invention remains uncertain. Perhaps Jayne herself blurred the lines deliberately, knowing that mystery itself could be more powerful than fact. For Jayne, who had long mastered the art of turning scandal into currency, this association may have been less about belief and more about performance. In aligning herself with LaVey, she once again ensured that the world could not look away. In an era when polite society recoiled from anything tinged with the satanic, her willingness to pose beside him guaranteed headlines. Yet was there also something deeper at play? Did the woman who had suffered so much loss, whose career had begun to fade, whose marriages had fractured, find comfort in the rituals of another kind of theater, a theater cloaked in mystery and rebellion? The truth is elusive. Friends offered conflicting accounts. Some insisted she merely toyed with the idea, treating it as a game, while others swore she took it seriously, drawn to LaVey's philosophy of indulgence and freedom from restraint. Perhaps, as with so much of her life, it was both. A performance for the cameras and a private exploration of something that spoke to her loneliness. For Jayne was no stranger to contradictions. And in this, too, she lived both on the stage and in the shadows. Whispers of curses followed her from this association. Tabloids suggested that LaVey, angered by Jayne's eventual distance from him, placed a hex upon her and her lover at the time, Sam Brody. Stories grew wild, that accidents, quarrels, and even her untimely death were the result of this curse. Whether such tales hold truth or are merely inventions of a gossip-hungry press hardly matters, for they added to her legend. In death, as in life, Jayne Mansfield was never permitted to be simple. She was always myth, always spectacle, always more than merely herself. There is a strange poetry in her flirtation with the occult. For a woman who spent her life chasing light, camera flashes, spotlights, neon signs, it seems fitting that she also reached toward darkness, as though seeking balance. The candlelit rituals, whether sincere or staged, reflected the same hunger that drove her stunts, the hunger to be remembered, to matter, to stand apart in a world quick to forget. Was the occult for her another costume, another mask in the endless play of Jayne Mansfield? Or was it a final attempt to touch something beyond the fleeting applause, beyond the fading glow of fame? Imagine her in a quiet room of the Pink Palace, long after the children had gone to bed. The lamps are dimmed, candles burn low, their wax dripping onto dark cloth. Jayne sits before them, her golden hair catching the flicker of flame, her face half in light, half in shadow. LaVey's voice, deep and deliberate, fills the room, chanting words of power. She listens, perhaps amused, perhaps moved, perhaps both. Her eyes close for a moment, and in that stillness, one wonders what she sought. Protection, love, freedom, or simply the thrill of touching the forbidden. When the candles burned low and the visitors departed, silence would return once more to the palace. The rituals ended, the shadows retreated, and Jayne was left alone again with herself, her children sleeping upstairs, her career dimming, her lovers quarreling, her debts mounting. The occult, whether real or staged, could not banish these truths. Yet it offered her, if only for a moment, the sense of power she so often lacked, the feeling that she was not merely swept along by fate, but capable of shaping it. The whispers of curses, the rumors of rituals, the photographs of her beside the so-called Black Pope, all these became threads in her legend, threads woven into the fabric of her tragic story. They remind us that Jayne Mansfield was never content to live quietly, never willing to fade into the background. She embraced mystery as she embraced scandal, daring the world to look away, knowing it could not. And so the image lingers, candles guttering on a velvet-draped table, their flames wavering before they vanish into smoke. The room is left in darkness, the scent of wax and perfume heavy in the air, the silence unresolved as though waiting for another whisper, another secret, another question that cannot quite be answered. The candle smoke drifts into silence, curling in the air like a question without an answer, leaving only the heavy scent of wax and perfume. It lingers, but soon even that fades, and in its place comes the sharper odor of ink, the rustle of printed pages, the endless churn of tabloids that fed upon Jayne Mansfield's life as though it were a feast without end. If the candle's flame had been her own attempt to command mystery, the newspapers turned her into a caricature, stripping away complexity and reducing her to scandal. And in this cruel theater of words and images, she was both the star attraction and the victim. From the very beginning, Jayne had understood the power of publicity. She had wielded it like a weapon, staging appearances that guaranteed headlines. But as her career waned and her stunts grew more desperate, the tone of those headlines changed. Where once she had been hailed as daring, now she was mocked as vulgar. Where once her laughter seemed playful, now it was described as hollow. The tabloids, which had once amplified her fame, became instruments of ridicule, transforming her into a figure to be pitied or scorned. They recorded every quarrel, every stumble, every failed venture. When her marriages dissolved, they printed her tears. When she struggled financially, they exaggerated her desperation. When she posed for photographs that revealed more than convention allowed, they pretended outrage while selling millions of copies on the strength of those very images. The public, insatiable, consumed these stories, laughing at the excesses of a woman who had once made them laugh with her. The cruelty of such laughter is sharper than silence, for it leaves no space for dignity. And yet Jayne, resilient as ever, did not retreat. She continued to pose, to smile, to give interviews. She spoke of her children, of her ambitions, of her unyielding belief in her own talent. But the words were drowned beneath the flood of scandal. Few wanted to hear of her devotion as a mother, her intelligence, her longing for serious roles. They preferred instead the caricature, the woman spilling out of gowns, the starlet clinging to fame, the scandalous figure linked to curses and cults. Was she complicit in her own distortion, or was she simply powerless to resist once the machine had consumed her image? Perhaps both, for in giving herself to publicity, she had surrendered part of her control, and in grasping for it, she had only tightened the chains. Still, there was a strange defiance in her persistence. She knew the world laughed, and she laughed too, though perhaps more softly than before. Her laughter became a mask, hiding wounds that only deepened with time. But even a mask reveals something, the courage to face ridicule, the determination to remain visible even when visibility brought pain. It is easier to vanish, easier to surrender to silence. Jayne chose instead to endure the mockery, to walk into the storm with her head held high, sequins glittering like armor. The cruelty of the press reflected a deeper cruelty of society itself. In Jayne's treatment, we see how quickly the world turns on those it once adored. Women in particular were rarely forgiven for aging, for faltering, for refusing to remain frozen in the perfection of youth. Jayne, who had built her persona upon exaggeration, was doubly punished, for the very qualities that once made her famous were later cited as evidence of her decline. The joke that once delighted became the punchline of her downfall. In this sense, she was less an individual than a symbol of the fleeting nature of fame, a mirror held up to the culture that created and destroyed her. Imagine her sitting in a quiet cafe, a tabloid spread before her. The headlines scream her name, the photographs display her at unflattering angles, the words twist her life into something grotesque. She stirs her coffee slowly, eyes scanning the page. Does she feel anger or resignation, or perhaps a weary amusement? Does she wish to throw the paper aside, or does she fold it carefully, placing it into her purse as though even ridicule is proof that she still matters? The image is haunting because it is plausible, a woman both wounded and sustained by the very mockery that eroded her dignity. Yet even in this landscape of ridicule, she was not without defenders. Friends spoke of her warmth, her kindness, her generosity. Some journalists, less cruel than others, wrote of her intelligence, of her struggle to be recognized beyond her body. But these voices were faint, drowned by the louder chorus of derision. The myth of Jayne Mansfield had overtaken the reality of Vera Jane Palmer, and few cared to distinguish the two. The irony is sharp. She had once sought immortality through publicity, and in a sense, she achieved it. Decades later, her name still conjures images. Her photographs still circulate. Her legend still lingers. But the immortality she achieved was not the one she dreamed of. Instead of being remembered as a serious actress, she was remembered as a spectacle, a scandal, a tragic figure. Perhaps in some quiet corner of her soul, she foresaw this outcome. Perhaps she laughed not only at the world, but at the inevitability of her own caricature. The rain begins to fall outside, tapping softly against the window of the cafe. A copy of a tabloid lies abandoned on a bench, its pages dampened, ink running in streaks across her photograph. The image blurs. Her smile dissolves into smudges. Her eyes vanish into shadows. The pages are carried by the wind, tossed into puddles, trampled beneath indifferent feet. The story that once sold thousands of copies is now nothing but paper dissolving in the rain. And so we are left with that image. Newspapers tossed aside, their ink bleeding into the earth, her face blurred beyond recognition, her story distorted by gossip. The rain falls steadily, washing the ink away, but leaving behind the question of what was lost in the smudging. Was it only scandal, or was it also the truer face of Jayne Mansfield, unseen, unheard, beneath the caricature? The rain-soaked tabloids dissolve in the gutter, their blurred photographs swept along the street by water that glistens under dim street lamps. Ink that once shouted scandal now fades into nothing, carried away into drains and forgotten by morning. Yet Jayne Mansfield herself could not so easily be washed away. Even as Hollywood's embrace loosened, even as critics mocked and headlines turned cruel, she refused disappearance. If the great stages of cinema were closing their doors, she would carve out smaller ones, nightclubs, cabaret halls, traveling shows, where her laughter could still echo, her sequins still catch the light, her name still draw an audience. By the mid-1960s, Jayne's career in film had slowed to a trickle. Roles that once promised stardom no longer arrived, and the films offered were often low-budget productions overseas, more curiosity than craft. But the woman who had fought her way into Hollywood with daring stunts and relentless determination did not surrender easily. She turned instead to the nightclub circuit, a path taken by many fading stars, where the intimacy of small rooms and smoky air provided a different kind of stage. In these venues, she became not a character in a scripted comedy, but herself, or rather, the self she had constructed, larger than life, playful, outrageous. Her shows mixed song and dance with humor, often leaning upon the caricature that the public already believed her to be. She sang in a breathy voice. She cracked jokes about her own body. She winked at the audience as if sharing a secret. To some, it was kitsch. To others, it was delight. Whatever the judgment, Jayne threw herself into the performance with the same vigor she had once brought to cinema. The audiences were varied. Some came out of genuine affection, recalling the star of The Girl Can't Help It and Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter? Others came out of curiosity, to see in person the woman whose scandals filled newspapers, whose image was plastered on pulp magazines. Still others came to mock, to laugh, not with but at her, treating her presence as novelty. Jayne knew this, and yet she went on, for the applause, whatever its motive, was still applause, and the sound of clapping hands still reminded her that she existed, that she was not forgotten. There is a strange nobility in these performances. To stand upon a stage when the world has dismissed you requires courage. To smile when the laughter is cruel requires resilience. Jayne did both, night after night, stepping into sequined gowns that sparkled under dim spotlights, her hair perfectly coiffed, her smile unwavering. She carried the aura of a star into rooms that could not match the grandeur of cinemas, and in doing so, she gave even the smallest nightclub a touch of Hollywood. But the toll was heavy. Nightclub circuits were grueling, demanding constant travel, late nights, and the strain of maintaining energy for audiences that were not always kind. The money, though necessary, was rarely enough to ease her financial burdens. She performed in Las Vegas, in New York, in Europe, in small towns where her name still drew attention, no matter how faded her fame. Behind the glamour of sequins lay exhaustion. Behind the smiles lay debts. Behind the laughter lay loneliness. Still, she embraced the stage. For Jayne, performance was not merely work, it was survival. Without it, she risked slipping into obscurity, a fate she feared more than ridicule. Better to be mocked and remembered than to be forgotten entirely. And so she sang, she danced, she laughed, she posed, each night a battle against invisibility. Perhaps she knew the battle could never truly be won, but still she fought, for fighting was the only way she had ever lived. The nightclubs themselves carried an atmosphere that suited her paradox. The air thick with smoke, glasses clinking, murmurs of conversation blending with the music, the stage lit just enough to set her apart from the shadows. All of it created a space both intimate and unforgiving. Every gesture was magnified, every note carried directly into the ears of those only a few feet away. There was no camera to edit, no director to frame, no illusion of distance. In those rooms, Jayne stood exposed, raw and real in a way the screen had never required. Did the audiences see her then? Truly see her? Beyond the caricature? Or did they only see the mask, the blonde bombshell they expected? Perhaps the answer was different for each pair of eyes in the crowd. Imagine her finishing a song, applause rising unevenly, some clapping with sincerity, others out of habit, still others laughing among themselves. She bows gracefully, her smile wide, her eyes bright, as though the sound were thunderous. She leaves the stage and retreats to a small dressing room where the mirror is streaked, the lights dimmer than those she once knew. She removes her earrings, sets down her glass, and sits in silence. Outside, the sound of chairs scraping and glasses refilled reminds her that the show has already been forgotten, replaced by the next drink, the next joke, the next distraction. She sighs but then straightens. For tomorrow, another stage awaits, another chance to be seen. There is something haunting in this image. A star who once commanded Hollywood now shining in rooms filled with cigarette smoke and half-hearted applause. Yet there is also something admirable. For even in decline, Jayne Mansfield refused erasure. She chose presence over absence, performance over surrender, laughter over silence. In doing so, she embodied both tragedy and courage, a woman unwilling to let the world decide when her story was finished. The sound that lingers is not applause, but the scrape of chairs across the floor, the clinking of glasses, the faint murmur of conversations drifting away as the audience leaves. The music has stopped, the lights have dimmed, and Jayne is left alone in the dressing room, her reflection once again the only witness to her endurance. The scrape of chairs and the fading murmur of conversations drift into silence, leaving only the echo of Jayne's footsteps in a narrow backstage corridor. Outside, a car waits to carry her through the night to the next town, the next stage, the next audience. The nightclub world, with its smoky rooms and uneven applause, had become her livelihood, and so she pressed onward, city after city, highway after highway, as though motion itself might preserve the fragile glow of her fame. The road, dark and unending, became both her companion and her adversary, offering her stages to survive upon, but also demanding a relentless endurance that wore down body and spirit alike. In these years, the image of Jayne Mansfield was no longer confined to the glamour of Hollywood, but was increasingly tied to the grind of touring life. She traveled by car more often than by plane, sometimes with her children, sometimes with lovers, sometimes with managers and musicians. The nights stretched long, the highways unlit, the monotony broken only by neon signs at the roadside promising motels, diners, and gasoline. Within the car, she rested in brief intervals, her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass, her sequined costumes packed in suitcases beside her. Between one town and the next, she rehearsed songs, adjusted makeup in small mirrors, laughed at jokes, or sometimes simply stared into the dark, the hum of the tires beneath her a lullaby both comforting and cruel. The road life demanded sacrifices. Sleep was scarce, food was hurried, privacy non-existent. Jayne, who had once glided into premieres beneath camera flashes, now slipped into roadside motels where no cameras followed, her pink world reduced to cramped rooms with peeling wallpaper and humming air conditioners. Yet she carried her glamour with her like a talisman. Even in modest surroundings, she found ways to sparkle, her hair styled, her perfume lingering, her laughter refusing to fade. Perhaps she believed that if she kept the performance alive, the world might yet remember the woman behind it. These tours carried with them not only exhaustion, but also danger. The highways of mid-century America were long and poorly lit, and travel was often undertaken at night to make the next engagement by morning. Accidents were common, fatigue a constant threat. Jayne herself was no stranger to minor collisions, close calls, and the weary vigilance required of those who lived their lives in perpetual motion. Still, she pressed forward, as though the momentum of the road might keep at bay the encroaching shadow of obscurity. Her companion in these final tours was often Sam Brody, her attorney and lover, a man whose presence in her life was marked by turbulence. Their relationship was passionate but stormy, filled with quarrels that spilled into public view, arguments overheard by friends and strangers alike. Yet he remained at her side, driving her from place to place, sharing in the exhaustion and the endless highways. To outsiders, their bond appeared destructive, but to Jayne, who had always lived amidst intensity, perhaps it seemed no different from the passions that had defined her earlier loves. Her children, too, were sometimes with her on these journeys, carried across miles in the back seats of cars, lulled to sleep by the rhythm of the road. Their presence softened the grind, their laughter filling the spaces between performances, reminding Jayne of the tenderness that lay beneath her sequined armor. Yet their presence also sharpened the risks, for the highways that carried her career forward also placed them in danger. Jayne must have known this, must have felt the quiet unease of a mother exposing her children to the hazards of a life lived in motion. But necessity drove her onward. The road was her only stage now, and she could not abandon it. The image of Jayne in these final years is one of contrast. The glitter of sequins beneath nightclub lights, and the weary slump of her body against a car seat afterward, the laughter of an audience and the silence of a highway stretching endlessly ahead, the warmth of her children's voices and the cold glare of headlines mocking her decline. She lived between these extremes, never finding rest, always moving, always performing, as though to stop would be to vanish entirely. Imagine her on a particular night, stepping out of a club into the humid air, applause still echoing faintly behind her. She waves, she smiles, she allows photographs to be taken. Then she slips into the back of a car, the door closing with a dull thud. The neon lights of the nightclub recede, replaced by darkness, the road stretching ahead like an unending ribbon. Within the car, she adjusts her coat, perhaps leans her head against Sam's shoulder, perhaps closes her eyes. Outside, the headlights pierce the night, illuminating only a few feet at a time. The world beyond is shadow, the destination uncertain, the journey relentless. There is a melancholy beauty in these highways, in the way they carry both dreams and tragedies. They are indifferent, neither hostile nor kind, offering only distance to be crossed, miles to be endured. For Jayne, they were the arteries of her final years, pumping her from one engagement to the next, sustaining her life even as they drew her closer to its end. She may not have known it consciously, but perhaps she felt it in some quiet corner of her soul, that the road, which had carried her from Texas to Hollywood, from Hollywood to Europe, from Europe back to America, would one day carry her no further. The headlights shine on, unwavering, two bright eyes staring into darkness. The car hums, the tires turn, the road stretches endlessly, and Jayne Mansfield, weary yet determined, continues her journey, unaware of how close she travels to silence. The headlights shine on, unwavering, two bright eyes staring into the darkness, illuminating only the narrow path of road immediately ahead. Beyond that glow lies mystery, silence, and the unseen. It was on such a highway, in the deep hours of the night, that Jayne Mansfield's restless journey found its abrupt and final ending. The summer of 1967 had been long with travel, her schedule filled with nightclub appearances, interviews, and drives across the humid South. On June 28th, she performed in Biloxi, Mississippi, smiling still, sequins catching the stage lights, laughter echoing for a crowd that came to see the spectacle of Jayne Mansfield in the flesh. But when the show ended, the night did not offer rest. Instead, it demanded another journey. She, along with her lover Sam Brody, her driver Ronnie Harrison, and three of her children, Miklos, Zoltan, and Mariska, climbed into a 1966 Buick Electra, its chrome glinting faintly under street lamps, and began the long drive toward New Orleans. The hour was late, the air heavy with Gulf humidity. The children slept in the back seat, their small breaths steady, innocent of the danger ahead. Jayne, weary from the performance, leaned into the cushions of the car, her platinum hair catching the dim glow of dashboard lights. Sam sat beside her, their driver focused on the highway unfurling ahead in darkness. The road was ordinary, a two-lane stretch lined with fields and trees, the kind of highway countless cars had traveled without incident. Yet fate often chooses ordinary places to unveil its tragedies. Sometime before dawn near Slidell, Louisiana, the Buick approached a semi-trailer truck that had slowed on the road. The truck sprayed a fog of insecticide into the air, a white cloud that hung dense in the headlights. The mist was blinding, a curtain of pale smoke that obscured the world beyond. By the time the driver realized the shape of the truck hidden within the cloud, it was too late. The Buick collided with the rear of the trailer at high speed. In an instant, metal shrieked, glass shattered, bodies were thrown forward, and silence fell heavy upon the humid night. The three adults in the front seat, Jayne, Sam, and Ronnie, were killed instantly. The children in the back, shielded by their smallness, survived, though injured. The wreckage was discovered soon after, a grotesque scene of twisted chrome and shattered lives, the car crushed beneath the truck with a violence that seemed almost deliberate in its finality. Jayne Mansfield, once the darling of Hollywood, once the mistress of spectacle, lay silent, her life extinguished at only 34 years old. News of the crash spread quickly, carried by radio, television, and the very tabloids that had so often mocked her. The details, grotesque and exaggerated, became part of her legend. Rumors circulated that she had been decapitated, a falsehood born from the severity of the crash and the sensational hunger of the press. In truth, her injuries were severe, but not as described. Yet the image of her golden head separated from her body entered the cultural imagination, a cruel distortion that clung to her legacy as persistently as any role she ever played. Even in death, she was denied dignity, transformed once more into spectacle. For those who loved her, the tragedy was not myth, but raw grief. Her children, though spared their lives, carried both the scars of the accident and the absence of a mother whose embrace would never return. Friends and colleagues mourned, remembering her not as caricature, but as the warm and generous woman who laughed easily and loved deeply. The Pink Palace, her eccentric kingdom, grew silent, its rooms echoing with the absence of her voice. Hollywood, though already distant from her, paused briefly to take note of the star whose flame had been extinguished too soon. The crash on that Louisiana highway was more than an accident of metal and speed. It was the inevitable culmination of a life lived at relentless pace. Jayne had chased fame across continents, sacrificed sleep to the demands of stages and tours, endured scandal, heartbreak, and ridicule, always moving, always performing, as though to stop was to disappear. And in the end, it was on a road, in motion, in pursuit of the next engagement, that her life ended. There is a bitter poetry in this, as though the road itself, which had carried her dreams since childhood, had also carried her to silence. One imagines the stillness afterward, the headlights shattered, their beams extinguished, the hum of tires replaced by the distant chirp of insects, the air heavy with the scent of gasoline and insecticide. The children stir in the back seat, confused, crying softly, unaware of the full measure of loss. A truck stands silent above the crushed Buick, its size dwarfing the fragile remains below. The sky begins to pale with the first hints of dawn, a new day rising indifferent to the tragedy that has unfolded. And in that pale light, Jayne Mansfield's story reaches its earthly conclusion. Yet legends do not end so easily. Her death, shocking and sensational, ensured that she would not fade quietly into obscurity. Instead, it cemented her place in the pantheon of Hollywood's tragic figures, alongside Monroe and others whose lives ended too soon. The crash became part of her myth, retold endlessly, embellished by rumor, etched into memory not for what it truly was, but for what the world imagined it to be. Jayne Mansfield, who had lived as spectacle, died as spectacle, her story blurred by both truth and invention. The night grows still once more, the image of headlights extinguished, leaving behind only darkness. The road lies empty now, save for the faint marks of tires and the broken glass that glitters faintly in the dawn light. The silence that follows is heavy, unbroken, as though the world itself holds its breath, mourning not only the woman but also the fleeting brilliance she embodied. The dawn light glitters faintly on the shards of broken glass scattered across the Louisiana highway. Tiny fragments that once belonged to windows now open to the sky. They shimmer like cruel jewels, catching the first rays of morning as though mocking the lives they had framed only hours before. The wreck is cleared, the road swept, yet the memory of that night cannot be so easily erased. In its place rises something both less and more than truth, rumor, myth, and legend. For in death, as in life, Jayne Mansfield was not permitted simplicity. The world, insatiable, reshaped her tragedy into spectacle, feeding upon it as hungrily as it had fed upon her stunts and scandals in life. Almost immediately, grotesque stories emerged. Newspapers whispered that she had been decapitated in the crash, a detail repeated so often that it hardened into cultural memory despite being false. The image was too lurid, too sensational for the tabloids to resist. Jayne's platinum hair, once a symbol of her allure, became in these accounts a grotesque detail of her death, carried from one gossip to another like a macabre trophy. The truth, that her body had been broken but not so disfigured, was drowned beneath the hunger for the shocking. Even in death, she was objectified, her dignity sacrificed for headlines that sold papers by the thousands. Some spoke of curses, of Anton LaVey and his whispered hexes, weaving the occult into her demise. Others blamed her reckless lover, Sam Brody, citing his stormy temper and the string of quarrels that preceded the fatal journey. Still others saw only the inevitability of fate, the relentless grind of the road that demanded too much of a weary star. The children, injured but alive, became unwilling bearers of her story, their survival a kind of miracle set against the cruelty of loss. Yet even their innocence was not shielded from gossip, for photographs of the accident circulated freely, their trauma displayed for strangers to consume. The Pink Palace grew quieter in the wake of her death. The heart-shaped pool still reflected the sky, the walls still glowed with shades of blush, but the laughter that once filled its halls was gone. Visitors entered with hushed voices, as though stepping into a mausoleum rather than a home. The pool tiles that read, "I love you," Jayne seemed now like an epitaph, a declaration left to echo in her absence. Friends and family gathered, mourning privately while the public devoured stories that reduced her to scandal. The duality that had defined her life, the warm mother and the caricatured star, remained unresolved, even in memory. Hollywood, which had long turned its gaze elsewhere, paused briefly to acknowledge her passing. Tributes were issued, polite and measured, yet few truly captured her complexity. For the industry, Jayne had been both asset and burden, a woman who brought attention but also controversy, a performer who embodied an archetype yet longed to break free of it. Her death, tragic as it was, served more as a closing chapter to an archetype than as recognition of her talent. She was remembered less as an actress and more as a cautionary tale. Her name added to the litany of stars destroyed by the very dream they pursued. And yet, among the public, her image endured. Posters, photographs, and film stills continued to circulate. Fans remembered her humor, her daring, her unabashed presence. Some mourned sincerely, recalling the joy her performances had brought, while others repeated the lurid myths with the same fascination once reserved for her stunts. Jayne Mansfield, once alive and complicated, had become a symbol of excess, of tragedy, of the fleeting and cruel nature of fame. There is tragedy not only in her death, but in the way her memory was shaped afterward. The woman who spoke multiple languages, who studied philosophy and played classical piano, who adored her children and worked tirelessly, was forgotten beneath layers of myth. In her place stood the caricature, the blonde bombshell who laughed too loudly, who revealed too much, who died too young. The myths consumed the woman, leaving only fragments of her true self to be glimpsed by those who looked closely. And yet perhaps this too was inevitable. Jayne herself had lived by spectacle, by daring the world to look at her, to remember her, even if it was through scandal. In life, she blurred the line between truth and performance so thoroughly that in death, the world could do no less. She became not only a woman, but a legend. Her story repeated endlessly, reshaped by each telling, like glass, shattered and rearranged into different patterns, each shard reflecting a fragment of her light. Imagine the world in those days immediately after her death. Papers on breakfast tables, headlines screaming, photographs displayed without mercy. Strangers who had never met her spoke of her as though they knew her, repeating details half true, half invented. Her name was spoken in beauty parlors, in barber shops, in classrooms, in factories. For a brief moment, she was everywhere, her death reviving the attention her career had struggled to sustain. But it was not the attention she had once dreamed of. It was fascination tinged with pity, with cruelty, with prurient curiosity. Her children grew beneath the shadow of these myths, each carrying both the gift and the burden of her legacy. They lived with the memory of a mother tender and warm, yet were surrounded always by the world's distorted image of her. In them, perhaps, the truer Jayne survived, glimpsed not in headlines but in small memories. Her laugh in the kitchen, her embrace at night, her voice reading a story. These fragments, carried quietly in their hearts, may be the closest the world will ever come to knowing the woman beneath the spectacle. The glass still glitters on the roadside, even as the morning sun rises higher. Cars pass by, their drivers unaware or uninterested, the world already moving on. Yet in that glimmer, faint and fleeting, lies the reminder of a story unfinished, of a woman both remembered and misunderstood. The echoes of her laughter remain, carried not by applause but by memory, lingering faintly like a voice heard in the distance, impossible to grasp, yet impossible to forget. The shards of glass glitter still in the morning sun, scattered like tiny constellations across the roadside, fading as cars pass and wheels grind them into dust. They are fragments of a larger whole now broken, much as the memory of Jayne Mansfield exists only in fragments, some true, some distorted, some invented altogether. And as the years stretched forward from that dawn in 1967, her story continued to live, not in the warmth of her presence, but in the strange, shifting patterns of remembrance. She became less a woman and more a legend, a name evoked with a mixture of amusement, pity, and fascination. Yet in the quiet, away from tabloids and myths, her legacy lingered most deeply in the lives of her children and in the questions that memory refuses to answer. Her children grew into adulthood carrying both the shadow and the light of her memory. Jayne Marie, the eldest, bore the earliest recollections, remembering her mother's tenderness, her determination, her contradictions. Miklos and Zoltan carried memories tempered by tragedy, shaped by the accident that had wounded them as children and marked their lives forever. Mariska, only 3 at the time of the crash, grew up with little direct memory of her mother, yet carried her legacy in her features, her voice, her path into acting. Antonio, the youngest, would know his mother only through stories told by others, inheriting love secondhand but still strong. Through each of them, fragments of Jayne endured, not the caricature, but the woman, glimpsed in gestures, in laughter, in resilience. Mariska, in time, would become famous in her own right, an actress beloved for her long career, known for strength and compassion. In her face and her presence, many saw echoes of Jayne, though of a quieter kind. It was as though the flame of her mother, so fierce and flamboyant, had been tempered into something steadier, enduring not in spectacle, but in substance. In this way, Jayne's legacy did not vanish, but transformed, rippling outward into lives that carried forward her love more than her scandal. Perhaps this is the truest form of immortality, not the gossip of tabloids, but the resilience of children who survive and thrive. Beyond her family, Jayne's place in Hollywood history remained both secure and unsettled. She was remembered as one of the great blonde bombshells, her name spoken alongside Monroe, Mamie Van Doren, and others of that archetype. Yet she was also remembered as parody, as excess, as tragedy. Her films continued to circulate, sometimes watched with nostalgia, sometimes with irony. For some, she was a symbol of a bygone era, a reminder of Hollywood's golden age and its merciless cruelty. For others, she was an object of camp, her exaggeration embraced not with ridicule but with affection, as though her flamboyance had outlived its mockery. The image of Jayne Mansfield persisted, but rarely did it align with the woman who once whispered dreams to herself beneath Texan skies. And yet, within her story lies a reflection of something larger. She embodied the hunger for fame that defined not only her era but every era, the tension between being seen and being consumed, between performance and truth. She revealed the cruelty of a culture that adores women for their beauty while mocking them for using it, that celebrates spectacle while denying the humanity beneath it. Her life was a mirror held up to Hollywood, and what it reflected was not only her own tragedy, but the fleeting, fragile nature of all fame. What remains most haunting, perhaps, is the question of whether she was ever truly seen. Did the world see the young girl who played piano in Texas, who studied languages, who longed for Shakespeare? Did they see the devoted mother tucking children into bed, her laughter gentle in quiet halls? Or did they see only the bombshell, the caricature, the scandal? Perhaps she herself blurred the lines too thoroughly to separate them, playing the role until it consumed her. Or perhaps the world chose not to see, preferring the mask to the woman. Imagine her now, not on a stage, not before cameras, but walking alone beneath a twilight sky. The day has ended. The air is cool. The horizon glows faintly with the last traces of sun. She walks quietly, without sequins or spotlight, her hair loose, her face unpainted. There's no audience, no applause, only the sound of her own footsteps and the soft chorus of evening insects. In that moment, she is not a star, but simply Jayne, a woman seeking peace. This image, though imagined, offers something truer than the headlines, the humanity that fame could never erase. The Pink Palace itself, long after her passing, became a kind of monument, remembered by those who drove past its blush-colored walls. It too would fade, sold and altered, eventually demolished, its heart-shaped pool filled in, its eccentric rooms erased. Yet for those who once saw it, the memory remained. A house that embodied both her triumph and her tragedy, a place where fantasy was built upon fragile foundations. In its destruction lies another metaphor, that no matter how bright, how flamboyant, how carefully constructed, even palaces fade, leaving only memory behind. And so, the story of Jayne Mansfield ends not with the crash on a Louisiana highway, nor with the rumors that followed, nor even with the myths that cling to her name. It ends here, in reflection, in the awareness that a life so brief can still ripple endlessly outward. She remains both caution and inspiration, both parody and poignancy, both laughter and sorrow. She remains a star, not for the roles she played, but for the way she embodied the contradictions of fame itself. The shards of glass that once glittered on the roadside have long since been swept away. The cars have long since passed. The road carries new travelers. But in memory they still glimmer faintly, like fragments of a star fallen from the sky. And in those fragments the question remains, whispered into the silence. Was she ever truly seen or only dreamed?